Hello, good evening, everybody. This is Ram here. Hope you had a great week and welcome on to this webinar on risk management. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes, and before that, I'd just like to do a little sound check. Are you all able to hear me? If you are, just type OK, or if you have any issues with the audio, raise your hand. If you can hear me, just type yes, you can hear me, please. Can you all hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot, Anubhav. We'll just give a couple of minutes before we get started. So I'd like to make this as interactive as possible because risk management, I think, will be nice to discuss how risk is handled in your organization. So maybe towards the end of this webinar, maybe right before we address your questions, if there are any volunteers, you can just talk about the various facets of risk management. I'll try to cover as much as possible, but I can only provide a high-level overview in this webinar. Wonderful. Are you also able to see the slides, if we can? Wonderful. So many people have said yes. If you can see the slides as well, another yes. Yeah, I think that's what Anubhav probably answers. Great. So let's just get started. I think it's about 2-3 minutes after 5. So welcome once again to this webinar on risk management. This is part of an ISM-INDIA webinar series, and this is this is my first webinar after a couple of years. I was doing webinars at ISM a couple of years, and I hope to restart the habit, just share my knowledge with you all. The first topic that I'm going to be talking about is risk management. And just before that, I'd like to introduce myself for the benefit of those that don't know me. I am an independent trainer and consultant. I'm based in Chennai, and I offer consulting services across the spectrum to companies, mostly in strategy, development, and growth consulting, as well as my area of expertise, which is in supply chain management. I born and raised in Chennai, and I did my engineering here as well. It's a local university, and then I went to do an MBA in the US. I went to Purdue University. Post my MBA, I was working in the US for a personal equipment manufacturer called FedEx across a variety of roles, mostly within supply chain. I was, category manager. I was doing transportation sourcing. I was in a global sourcing role as well, with a focus on China and India. And this experience tremendously helped me, understand a lot about supply chain and improve my knowledge. I managed categories with over $100 million of spend spread across North America, Europe. and I was part of an interesting project where we had a 3PL deployed, from our various supplier bases in China and India, and then supply to our various factories located across Europe and North America. I currently do a lot of training in supply chain as well as public speaking, wherein there is time and there is a good opportunity as well. I did my CPSM at about, in 2010. It feels like a long time back, but that's how it goes. The time really flies. So looking forward to this webinar. So I'm just going to set you up with the agenda for today. We're going to be, I'd like to encourage as much as possible, given this is a webinar. I know I'm going to be the one that's doing the bulk of the speaking, but when an opportunity presents itself, I appreciate if you could share, your thoughts and opinions if you have any, and especially for the benefit of all those that are here, if you could share how your company handles risk management, that would be of great benefit, because I think depending on the industry and depending on the size and scope of the operation, risk management is handled differently across companies. So for the next hour, we will be taking a look at first. We'll be taking a higher level look at how our function, procurement and supply management, has evolved with time, as well as take a little bit of a peek at how it's going to look like in the future, because knowing how our function is going to evolve in the future will give us an idea of the various risks that are involved. So that is going to set us up for, to get really dovetail into risk management. But I'll be talking a little bit about what is risk and what are the various risk classifications of risk. We will also be looking at how we manage risk, as well as there are two main types of risk: risks that you really know how they go, known risks, or unknown risks, which you can't really prepare for, but there are ways in which you can set yourself up to mitigate or minimize the impact of such risks. Towards the end, we'll be doing a little bit of a Q&A. I know typically that this extends beyond 15 minutes, so as long as there is questions and as long as they are relevant to the webinar, I'll be happy to answer them. So even if it takes beyond 15, I'll be happy to answer them. So time management is important. Phones, I guess it doesn't really matter because you're all muted. And I think, unfortunately, this might not work well for this webinar. So if you have any questions, please make sure you type them. And when there is a chance for you guys to speak, you can raise your hand. So I will call you out and then unmute you. You can speak. So this is going to be only at the end of the webinar. So for the first timers especially, this is something that you should pay attention to. And if you're a veteran, don't really mind. So these are some of the words that we live in. So this is typically our world on an everyday basis. But really, I'll just take a look back at history to see how we've now evolved into more of a strategic function. Earlier, it was purely just a clerical function where, procurement managers or buyers were sending out POs, tracking deliveries, and calling up customers or suppliers for payment-related issues. At some point, I think towards maybe the late 70s or 80s, the focus started shifting towards ensuring compliance. We started measuring supplier performances across quality and delivery in a very, very rough manner. I think the initial thought was there in terms of measuring supplier performance, but really, I think what it took is a big change. I think I would relate this more towards the lean manufacturing, where really the whole idea of waste and cost came into, as well as quality came into focus. And this really was the approach for a good decade or so, wherein after maybe the 90s and towards as computers became more and more used across the enterprise, then the emphasis became on analytics we started looking at what is the total life cycle cost of ownership of a part or an asset. We really started looking at risk management. And this really, I think, was driving a lot of this, driving us into the, early 21st century as well. And then there became a change where, both in procurement, not just as a profit center where we generate a lot more profit for the corporation, but also we became very strategic, wherein it could be used as an advantage, a comparative advantage across the world. Supply chain became very, very important, and as a result, our function as well gained strategic importance. A lot of companies started elevating, HCPOs as well. The first step was to have a position called a CPO, and then eventually have them give them a seat in the boardroom. And then, well, really, next 2020 onwards, what does the future hold? Well, your guess is as good as mine, but here are, some of the next gen supply chain. I think conceptualizing or visualizing what the supply chain of the future is going to look like will sort of tell us what are the risks or what are the various things that we have to think about in the future. And by no means are these, by no means am I saying that this is how it is going to be, but this is possibly one of the ways it's going to be. And this is, some of these might be true for now itself, but I guess the strategic importance or the finer margins are going to dictate how a company is going to succeed. So supply chains of the future are going to have, earlier we were just moving a product from point A to point B and tracking it and understanding it, but now no longer is it A to B. I mean, there are several nodes of operation involved, several across the value chain. Operations are split into several steps. So as a result, the supply chain has become far more complex. So in order to succeed, supply chain needs to be highly optimized, where as much as consumer behavior changes, and we've become very fickle as human beings these days because of the gamut of options that are available. So consumer behavior constantly changes. So as a result, supply always needs to be, in close consonance with demand. So if demand, for example, changes, earlier we used to have clear season in which we know demand is going to be higher, but right now it's not really. Some businesses are still run seasonally, but again, most of the businesses, the lack of seasoning has come down. It's become rapidly changing and evolving. So as a result, supply chains have to be not just optimized, but also very flexible in reacting to those changes, as well as really fast. I think customers are no longer happy to wait for anything. They want everything now. As soon as they click on ordering, they want it immediately delivered. And people, companies like Amazon have really set the ball rolling in this aspect. I think they're doing daily delivery, same-day delivery as well, which is an amazing thing if you can just think about it. And those are some of the ways companies are pushing the boundaries in our field. So they have to be optimized, they have to be flexible, fast, they have to be entirely data-driven. We are using a lot more data to make our decisions as regards to supply chain, but I think that is only going to increase. There is still a lot of data that is lying unutilized or unexplored. So the time we start making sense of the data, we can use that to make more meaningful decisions. That's going to help, increase shareholder value as well as increase customer satisfaction. There is also a great push to adopt green practices across the supply chain because that can only, we are using a lot more, unsustainable practices which are harming the environment. So that's going to be not just our responsibility, but it is also going to have customer decisions are going to depend on that. I think the companies that have a lot more green supply chains, I think customers naturally gravitate towards that. So the more green your practices and processes are, I think you can sort of use that as a marketing marketing feature as well. Um, Another feature of future supply chains is going to be we've gone past global. It's going to become local. I feel it's not only should we have a global worldview, but it can react to changes at a local level. I think we surely have to cater to customers all over the world, but again, we have to be able to react to however small changes they are. And the last point is certainly, I think this is what everybody is striving towards, is how we become really proactive in terms of identifying problems that are going to come up potentially in the future and how we're going to handle those problems as and when they come up. I think companies that do a really good job of identifying a whole sort of issues that can potentially disrupt their supply chain and sort of plan for them, I think they are going to be in a good position to do well in the future as well. So that brings us into, what is risk? It shouldn't even be what is risk management, but what is risk? I think risk, some ground rules, I think risk as a concept, I think is unavoidable. I think anything that you do, if you walk on the street, there is a chance that a vehicle is going to come and hit you. So there is a risk involved there. So all human endeavors, all endeavors by a corporation, they involve uncertainty and risk. I mean, if they didn't, I mean, our jobs would be fairly simple, right? Another thing that we should all understand is while the push is towards risk-free, we can never make risk, we can never, 0% is never a possibility. Just like how, when you think of it, 100% efficiency, whether it's an ideal or a goal, because the moment you get to 100%, maybe there is always room to improve more and more. So risk at the same time can never be 0%. We can only, we cannot eliminate it. We can only, we can keep it at a manageable level. That is the bigger point that I'm trying to make. And like I mentioned earlier, being proactive is always much better than being reactive. I think you take 2 or 3 steps ahead of the competition is as proactive as possible. And this is a very generic slide on the various classification of risk. Broadly, it can be classified as external as well as internal. Just think of it, when I say internal, you have to wear the hats of your whole company. So what happens within the company, for example, capacity, which involves anything from cost or financial factors, insurance, machine or asset downtime. These are all issues that are internal to an organization. And then, so those would be, those we would say internal risk. Operations. So broadly, capacity, operations, and increasingly a lot more risks are coming out of our information systems because we rely on computers to do everything for us. And as a result, the way our data is handled, the way it is stored, the way it is spread across various entities, and how it is shared, all those things gain more prominence. So those are all internal risks. On the other hand, there are certain risks that we are exposed to, sometimes within or beyond our control as well. So for example, a natural disaster may come in and wipe out, a plant or a supplier, and you will have to deal with it. These are typically, beyond our control as well. Again, political scenarios where, there is a war breaks out. These have happened sometimes in supply chain, and these are all very real possibilities. I think there may be labor disputes at a particular time. A government can come in and change a policy or, bring in new regulations, reform, completely change the way a function is or an industry is run. So these are all types of political risks. And then there is always going to be threats from, general market or your competitors. I think there is, there is the economic downturn, exchange rates may increase or decrease. There may be set of substitutes for your product or service, and then there's always technology that's going to drive. So these are, I don't focus too much, but these are typically some of the risks that are associated when we look at various types of risks. So broadly external and internal, but then if you really bring it down to narrow it down to at an organizational level, how do I plan or how do I manage this? Then you have to get into, there are broadly two types, right? One, that you're able to predict or you're aware of such risks. Those we can lump under a bucket called known risk. And then there is the other side where there are risks that you completely come in and you can only prepare for a scenario base. You can't really know what type of risk or when it's going to come in or how it is going to affect you. So if we were to just, I think I'll look at how we handle both types of risks as well. But first, let me focus on how we handle known risks, because companies, even though they very well know certain types of risks are there, more often than not, they don't do a very good job of managing such risks. But then again, there are various corporations manage risks differently. They have a risk management framework, and that is what I'm getting towards as well in this webinar. So as we are trying to build a risk management framework, how do we go about it? I think there are three questions that we have to ask ourselves when it comes to handling known risks. Because largely, I think when you build a framework, it has to involve, what we call known and unknown, but bulk of the focus is going to be on known, because those are the things that you know and are aware of and have data and information on. So, number one, if you're looking at this, what is going to be the impact on the organization? Is it a type, for example, is it the type of risk that if you're a multinational corporation that has 10 facilities across 5 countries, what is a specific type of risk can only impact 1 or 2 geographies or 1 or 2 plants. So while certain others can impact all 5. So these are some of the questions that you have to ask yourself as you're looking to establish a risk management framework. What is the impact on the organization going to be? Is it going to have a far-reaching impact, or is it going to have a very marginal impact? So most organizations have, either a numbering or a percentage basis in order to calculate all this, in order to do, assess the impact of a specific type of risk on the organization. The other really smart math that we'll all have to do is what is the likelihood or what is the chance of that risk or that scenario happening to you? These are all, for us laypersons, I think we don't really have to get into this whole calculation, but we can provide the inputs. But largely, I think there are tools and processes, and there are teams out there that help us with this. But it's good to be aware of their approach. Largely, like I said, they look at 3 things. One is the impact, the other is the likelihood or the probability of such an event or a scenario happening, and number 3. This is something that has been added on more recently. Earlier, it was just, impact as well as probability. But now, there is also the scenario of, is my company in my current state equipped to handle such a risk? What is the capability, if you may, in order to handle that particular risk? So, if you were able to sort of model all your risks within these 3 scenarios, we'd be able to create a numeric. It's a both combination of qualitative as well as quantitative, but really this can help us sort of prioritize various risks and see how we handle them as well as prepare a plan for them. So these are, like I mentioned, this is how we handle known risks. This is far more easier, I would say. If you take a look at the other type of risk, which is what we call unknown risk. You can't really plan, like I mentioned earlier, but what you can do, however, is sort of prepare scenarios, as in what are the various types of risk. Maybe look at it take a historical view, understand all the things that have happened that the organization was not prepared for, use that as a view to sort of forecast potentially some of the risks or some of the scenarios that can happen in the future. It is very important to have a very diverse cross-functional team do this, because within our realm of operation, we are only exposed to a certain type of functioning. So it makes it all the more reason for us to have a cross-functional team do this. Organizations have increasingly started, building risk awareness. Just merely communicating to the various people that are part of the team how their actions, have a level of risk associated with them. Just being aware sometimes always helps people do their jobs a bit more efficiently. Just when your action carries a lot of importance as well as risk associated with it, you do a better job. Just being aware, you sort of handle risk much better. You minimize yourself, or you expose yourself to lesser number of risks, if that is the case. And also, just like how we do emergency drills that work, you also have to have some form of contingency plan drawn up as to, if this happens, this is how I'm going to react, and so on. Let's move on to the next slide. So we talked about, how we're going to manage known risks. Really, I think there is no hard and fast rule. So first way of doing this is really understand the value chain of your note that I'm using the term value chain, not just merely supply chain. So value chain, right from every step from which your raw material gets converted into the finished good, each value addition, you can use it as a particular step. So if there are, 100 steps, or if there are 40 steps, if there are as much as they are, you'll have to make sure you list them down. So it's always helpful to be as detailed as possible, especially in this area, because the more comprehensive you are, the more the risk you might be able to catch, and the more risks you catch, the better prepared you can be when they eventually occur to you. So once you identify every node or every step where value is added to the raw material in order to make it finished good, then you can then look at what are all the risks associated with, that particular step. So even something as trivial as, so right now we have, multi-tiered supply bases. So we also have to understand and appreciate that it's going to be impossible to have 100% visibility into all tiers of the supply chain. So this is, I know I'm, saying two things that are seemingly contradictory, but again, that's the way I guess our function works. So we have to be as comprehensive as possible, but also ensure that we're not doing what we typically call, we don't waste our time detailing things that normally are not as important. So we'll have to take into consideration the various constraints that we have. There is no right or wrong in terms of doing this. It's just a matter of how efficiently you want to use your time. So be comprehensive, document all potential risk types. For example, if, I'll give, if you have a supplier who is 60% of whose total revenue comes from your organization alone, that is a big risk, because if, for example, your company's demand goes down, naturally the supplier is also going to have a lot of financial issues. So those are that's a financial risk, for example. Certain other suppliers might have capacity issues. So you can document all the risk types as it may, I guess, work for that particular supplier, and just be as comprehensive about it. The other thing is, this is something that supply chain can take the lead on, but this is not really. There are tools out there that do this for us. Where there are this risk management framework that we develop or the organization has developed. It has to monitor a lot of data in real time. Earlier, we used to, for example, I'll tell you how my organization, we were looking at this during the downturn of 2008. As a result, so ours, was a very reactive thing. So the moment the downturn hit, we had a lot of trouble with not just cost, but also capacity. A lot of suppliers had to file for bankruptcy, and we were in a bind to find new suppliers. So we went out and started a data or a fact-finding mission across all our suppliers, trying to understand their operational, financial, qualitative capacity. And this is, I'm not just talking about tier 1 suppliers, but we went into tier 2 and tier 3 as well, in order to find out, because, just like how you are dependent on your suppliers are dependent on their suppliers as well. So the more you do this, I think that sort of exercise, I think working in the supply chain function during the economic downturn really was a big help in terms of how to manage in terms of adversity. I think that really strengthened. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but it was a good learning experience, I think. So the point I'm making is, the more real time, or the more you're able to react to those changes, like I mentioned, as quickly as possible. So in order to, maybe it's not quite good anymore to do a monthly review. You'll have to start doing it on a daily basis, or I don't even know what the correct time is. But again, if those are being monitored in real time, all the more better. You have the latest and greatest data points for you to make decisions. And also, if we are looking at building this framework, just as much as our organization and roles and external environment changes, we also need to be cognizant of that and adapt the framework as soon as something changes. We shouldn't be afraid to change it to suit the particular operation. So broadly, I think I'll just summarize how you set this up, this whole framework. I talked about, in the previous slide, we talked about how we look at what is you ask these questions and try to come up with a qualitative/quantitative response to this. What is the impact on the organization? What is the probability that a particular risk will occur? And how is the organization equipped to handle it? So if you assign scores across all these 3 factors, you'll have a good quantitative data. But then how do you go about doing that? Number 1, you you identify each step across your value chain, and then you document all possible risk types that affect each step. You try to monitor them as close to real time as possible, and you constantly adapt or update your risk management framework. And I mean, I'm not talking about doing this all over Excel. I mean, there are a lot of tools that are out there that help make our jobs easier. So we should try to leverage technology as much as possible. But again, I'm a big believer in technology, but we have to be in control. I think once we start letting technology dictate how we go about doing our jobs, I think that's when we run into trouble. So as long as we are telling, the tools that we use, what we want to see, that's always in a better space to be. Not just tools and technology, but I think it is also important that we have very strong processes to make sure risk is managed and mitigated efficiently. I think sometimes, adherence to processes, it can look seemingly very trivial, but the devil is really in the detail. I think that is something that all of us can learn from the Germans. Is they document every little step. They're very, very finicky about following a particular process because, hey, processes are there for a reason. They would have, when the organization came up with a particular process, they would have imagined there are people that are going to be trying to bypass the process. So always stick to the process. And then as a company, you also have to have proper governance structures in place in order to ensure compliance to a particular process. So these, imagine there is so much complexity or there is so much to do in order to manage risks that we are aware of, or what we call known risks. Imagine, what it's going to be to handle unknown risks. I think there is a lot of data on this, but the image is something that I got from McKinsey and Company. These are all some of the types of unknown risks that can happen. But how we go about mitigating them is sort of, you can never prepare for these. However, or neither can you quantify them. But then what you do to overcome, or you set yourself up for success, or how you set yourself up to manage this as best as possible, is you build a culture of risk awareness within your company, and that can always help. I think some of the ways by which companies, or I've advised companies that go about handling risk management is hey, there is, especially when it comes to when your back's out of the wall and when there are risks that sneak up on you without even you being aware of, mistakes are bound to happen. So just again, it's easy for somebody else to say, but hey, that's a conversation you have to have with your boss. So, we all make mistakes, and I think if you are a boss or if you are somebody who's managing people, you always have to sort of not point fingers when such adverse scenarios happen, but then how can we learn from our mistakes? So easier said than done. So that is something that we'll have to work on. The other thing is building a very transparent culture on risk. So, how really, I think building a culture of risk awareness should be driven top down. I think organizations that have their senior management visibly exhibiting or visibly championing this process of risk, ensuring, how this is communicated to all the employees or everybody that is working in the organization. I think that goes a long way as well. The other thing is sort of encouraging people to take ownership of situations. I think I put it down as a responsiveness, but really it should be more empowerment. I think people that are working for a particular company need to take responsibility of their area of operation and sort of take ownership of the issue and say, hey, anything that happens within my sphere of operation is something that I take. So this sort of attitude will help them put more into their thought of managing, unknown risks, and that will also help them react in a very positive way and make better decisions when it comes to managing such risks, rather than waiting for somebody else to come in and say, hey, you have to do this, you have to do that. A lot of times taking ownership really helps. So this really is all that I have with regard to risk and how we manage it. I'll just quickly do a full run through. In the meantime, if you have, I think once I'm done with the run through, I'll open this up for about 5 to 10 minutes where, if really, I think we'll have the Q&A after that, but we'll spend about 5 minutes talking about how your organization uses risk, or if you have any inputs or if you have any thoughts, please feel free to put your hand up. You can talk about how your organization is managing it, what tools you are using, what processes or what frameworks you have. Just at a very high level, maybe you can take a minute or maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes at the most, but you can talk to us about how you handle risk management. Because that really, as I mentioned in the beginning, really depends on the type of organization. So I've kept it at a very high level for this webinar because we can only cover so much in 40 minutes. So yeah, this slide we can see. So I think we began with understanding how our function has evolved with time and the position that so from being very clerical, a lot of administrative work, to focusing on cost, looking at profit, and then being in a position to contribute to both top and bottom line together. It's sort of the stage we are at currently, but then the future is going to look very different. We're in a rapidly changing environment where the supply and demand needs to move closely in touch with each other. The more the gap, the bigger the problem we are going to have. Supply chains are going to have to be very flexible, very fast, and adaptive to external change. And this is, not just being aware of problems, but also change management is going to become big, because how we adapt and change ourselves to suit the external environment is going to become big. A lot of supply chains already are data driven, and I think that trend is going to continue. There is a lot of pressure to have green supply chains as well. A truly global supply chain is the push right now, and we all have to be a little bit more proactive to the change. And we sort of took a look at defining risk. What is risk? I mean, every little endeavor of ours as well as the company involves uncertainty and risk. You can never, completely eliminate risk. It's always there. It's one of those things. How you manage them, how you mitigate them is what sets apart various organizations. And keep saying this, but the hardest thing to do is to be proactive. Really go out and envision all the potential types of risks that can occur and then sort of prepare for that, rather than being very reactive. We took a look at broadly the two types of risks. One is things that are beyond our control, the sort of the external environment, and then things that are within our control, sort of internal to the corporation. And then when it comes to defining risk, we are able to broadly bucket risk into two categories. One is known risk and the other is unknown. It's as broad as they can be, but that's how it is. I think how you assess known risk is, you can sort of use this as well, this type of this classification as well, and then further do it into known and unknown. What is the impact? So the way you look at building a framework of sorts on how you manage your risk is try to get answer 3 questions for every type of risk that can potentially happen. What is the impact on your organization going to be? And you give a score to that. You can use whatever scoring methodology you want. What is the probability of that risk occurring, as well as how is my company equipped in this current state to handle such risk? The other, when it comes to unknown risk, is building a culture of risk awareness is going to be key. So try to prepare as many scenarios as possible when it comes to handling unknown risk. But again, I mean, like I said, it's impossible, but you really have, if you have a cross-functional team, it's going to obviously help. Building a risk awareness, culture of risk awareness is very important for every organization. And you also have to have contingency plans in place. How we understand, how do we get to all the known risks? You have to take a completely, comprehensive exercise where you identify every node in your supply chain or value chain. I should say value chain instead of supply chain. But again, document every little risk type, as trivial or as big as we be, as obvious as they can be. Make sure you put it all down and then set up a framework which is monitored on a regular basis as close to real time as possible. Constantly update your framework, leverage tools and technology as much as possible, install processes where there are gaps, and then have good governance structures in place in order to ensure compliance. Unknown risks, you can only do it by building risk awareness across the organization and sort of hope and pray for the best. But you also try to learn from previous mistakes. You communicate across the organization a culture of risk, then empower all your various employees or people that are reporting to you to handle risk on their own. So that's going to go a long way. At this point, we are done with the review as well.